In this chapter, we'll have a look at the Wireframe Modifier. And the Wireframe Modifier has been added in Blender 2.7. So it's basically brand new at this time, and surprise, surprise, if you add it to your mesh, it will turn into a wireframe. And there is a difference between this wireframe and the wireframe material. You can see this kind of looks alike. It's you can see it a lot better if you make this material red. Now, a lot is an exaggeration, but this is actually a solid mesh with a volume, while this is just illuminated edges. Okay, so let's have a look at the options. We have a thickness, which is basically self-explanatory. It controls the thickness of the solidification around the edges. And we can also influence the thickness with the vertex groups. Let's just do that. I'm just gonna take these two vertices and assign them to a group, and then I'll take these two vertices and assign them with half the weight. Let's take these two vertices and assign them with about half the weight, and then I'll adjust this. Say the group is supposed to influence my thickness, and if I deselect the mesh, you can see that those edges down there, they're gone. And if you look carefully, you can see that this edge is about half as thick as this, because these two vertices have about half the weight as those two have. You can also adjust this with a factor. If the factor is 0, then you actually have, where the weight is 0, you have a thickness of 0. But if you use the factor, I'm not sure if factor is the right word here, because it seems to add to your edge thickness. It doesn't seem to be multiplying, but still, factor increases everything until the point where everything is even again. Okay, so let's remove the group here and turn up the thickness a little more and have a look at the crease edges. You can see if I tick this, there is no difference, and the reason is edge creases don't make any difference until you use a Subsurf Modifier. Let me demonstrate. Subsurf Modifier subdivides and rounds your edges unless you tell it not to. So if I use this face here, I'm using actually the 4 edges of the face. Then I can go and increase the crease. That will flatten this out. This is not news for most of you, especially if you've seen the Subsurf part. And the crease edges basically does the same thing. If I add a Subsurf Modifier here and I don't crease the edges, you can see that it roundens the cube just as it rounded the lower part here. If I do crease the edges, I can control the weight. 0, of course, is the same as check mark off, and the more I increase this, the straighter the edges become, to a part even where they are sort of exaggeratedly straight. So about 0.8 should leave you with straight edges. Doesn't do anything unless you add a Subsurf Modifier below it. Then next option I want to look into is the even thickness. It doesn't really change that much. The wiki says that it usually produces a cleaner mesh. It takes a little bit more time to compute, and there can be a problem with very thin or skinny faces. I tried to produce an arrow with this. It says there can be spikes that occur. I tried to produce very skinny faces, but I couldn't get this arrow to occur. So just in case it happens to you, turn off even thickness. If not, leave it on. It looks a little bit better. To demonstrate the relative thickness, I'll need another mesh, so I'll skip that and I'll get to the material offset. Of course, for the material offset, we need at least 2 materials. In Blender and in arrays in general, everything starts with 0 and not with 1, so a material offset of 0 means the entire mesh is actually using material number 1, which is material number 0. If you choose a material offset, everything turns silver, so this option doesn't make much sense unless you don't replace the original. If you do replace the original, all you're left with is of course the wireframe, but if you uncheck this, you can see that your original mesh is preserved and it's right underneath your newly created wireframe, and the wireframe can have either the original material, which would be 0, or its own material, which would be in slot number 2, and in computer terms that's slot number 0. Which brings us to the offset option here. If you imagine that your wireframe here is wrapped around the edges, what I mean is if I use this edge, then our wireframe here will be wrapped around it. And of course it can be exactly underneath it, or entirely above it, or right in the middle. And an offset of 0 will place it around the edge. Basically the edge would be in the center. And if you offset this, it will travel all the way above the edges or all the way below the edges. And to demonstrate this further, I will not replace the original. This way, our wireframe is completely inside the original mesh, and this way it's completely outside the original mesh, and of course the rest is somewhere in between. This can actually make a pretty nice effect, I guess. Which leaves us with only two options, relative thickness and the boundary, and both can be demonstrated best with Suzanne. First I'll add the wireframe modifier to Suzanne, and you can see it's basically the same thing as with the cube, but with a lot more faces and therefore a lot more edges to turn into wireframe. I'll reduce the thickness a little bit, something like that, and let's check the relative thickness. And you can see, if I deselect this, you can see it better. The wireframe thickness will be determined by the area of the face, meaning smallest faces are here in the mouth, there they're very thin, and around the mouth where the faces are a lot thicker, there you also have a thicker wireframe. You can see the comparison. This is what the relative thickness does. It's quite handy if you have parts of your mesh that are heavily subdivided, then you get a thinner thickness, which will leave the larger faces sort of exaggerated or emphasized, and the lower faces won't look that crowded. One option left, it's the boundary. I'll turn off relative thickness for that, and if I turn on and off the boundaries, you see something happening in the eyes of Suzanne. And most of you will know Suzanne is not a closed mesh, so I'll just take her eye and separate the selection. I'll hide the rest. And if I turn around, look at this from behind, you can see this is open. So once again, this is an option that only does something in a special case. And in this case, if you have an open mesh that is not closed, like this, you see there's an opening back here, then you get open wireframe as well. If you want to close that, choose boundary, and it will be closed. I guess that's it about the wireframe modifier. The next chapter will be about the Laplacian diffusion.